Just a few days ago, the Global Times, which is a Chinese paper, released a story which indicated that China is ready to dump at least $200 billion worth of U.S. treasuries onto the market, eliminate them from their holdings, and potentially ready to use the nuclear option, which is just dump all of the U.S. treasuries onto the market, completely eliminate their entire holdings. Now, the reasons for this they cited were, U.S. government, the irresponsibility in fiscal policy and monetary policy, the ballooning debt, national debt compared to GDP, and prevention of extreme reactions by the U.S. of such things like U.S. military conflict and sanctions. Now, potentially in response to this, today President Trump was talking about the possibility of decoupling from China and how it would benefit the United States if we are completely decoupled from China in terms of where our businesses do their manufacturing and the amount of tariffs that the United States has on China. So today we are going to be looking at, number one, what does this all mean? Number two, what does it mean for the markets? And three, what does it mean for your wallet? Let's dive in. In total, right now, China holds a little over $1 trillion worth of United States treasuries. Now, quick recap, if you don't know what a treasury is, it's just debt, United States government debt. And so if you own a treasury, that just means you've loaned dollars to the United States government. And at the end of that loan, they promise to give those dollars back to you. Now, in centuries past, when governments have taken out loans, it is traditionally very difficult to pay back large amounts of debt because money was traditionally gold and or silver. Now, this meant that if the government took out too much in debt, the only way to pay back that debt to whoever they took out that loans from, whether it was their own people or other governments or businesses, the only way to pay that back would be to tax its citizens or to borrow even more to pay back the old debt, which would spike interest rates, because if you have to take out new debt to pay off your old debt, you're a credit risk. There's a big risk that you won't be able to pay that back. And so me as a lender, I'm going to charge a much higher interest rate for you. Well, in today's day and age, we obviously know this isn't the only option because money isn't backed up by anything. And so governments, through central banks, have the freedom to print as much money as they want, which means that outside of choice, it's not possible for a government to be forced into default if they take out debt in their own currency. And so the United States can take out debt in United States dollars to an infinite amount, and you don't ever have to worry about them defaulting on their debt. They can always just print new money to pay off that old debt. There's no limit on how much gold they have. They don't have to tax in order to pay that back. They can just print in order to pay back any amount of debt that they want. Now, this isn't a magic money tree because, as you might have guessed, just because you get the same number of dollars back that you lent to the United States government doesn't mean that those dollars will purchase for you the same amount of stuff as they did when you lent them. Now, this effect is what we commonly call inflation. It just means that when you print too much money, prices will rise to compensate for the fact that there's more money in the system chasing the same amount of goods. Now, for the past few decades, the United States and the Federal Reserve has really acted as kind of the central bank for the entire world. And the Treasury, therefore, has been kind of the reserve asset of the entire world. When the great financial crisis hit, the rest of the world kind of got together and said, hey, we don't want your recession and your crash spreading and rippling out through the rest of the world, and so we'll help you out. We know that you have to spend a ton of money, you take out a ton of debt in order to rescue the financial system, so we will bail you out. Since you're going to be doing all the spending, we'll make sure that we absorb the debt. So all the central banks around the world, they purchased a lot of treasuries. Again, that means they lent the United States government money. The implied plan was that as soon as the rescue was over, the United States would back off from that plan and start to wind down. The Federal Reserve would start to decrease its balance sheet and start to unload some of the debt that they had accumulated onto the market. And as the global economy got healthier and healthier, it would be able to absorb some of the losses and some of the debt and some of the pain, financial pain, that the Federal Reserve had swallowed during that time. helped out by the other central banks around the world. Well, very quickly it became clear that the Federal Reserve would never be able to unwind their balance sheet, because as soon as they started trying, it almost imploded financial markets once again. And it was really at that point when the rest of the world kind of looked collectively and said, hey, the United States is never going to be able to back out of this. They're only going to be able to increase the amount of stimulus, keep rates at, basically zero for eternity, continue to print more money, continue to monetize the debt. And this means that the amount of money that's being pumped into the system is going to erode the purchasing power of the debt that we already loaned to the United States government. The treasuries that we have, that we use to help bail them out 10 years ago, they're becoming more and more worthless because the United States government has to continue to increase the number of them that there are. And so if we wait until maturity to get our money back for this debt, yes, we'll still get the dollar amount back. But no, it will not be able to purchase for us the same amount of stuff that it would have been able to purchase for us originally, or even just a couple of years ago. Now, action on this plan to slowly reduce and eventually eliminate exposure to United States debt, to treasuries, has been especially pronounced with countries like Russia and China. And the nuclear option has been talked about with what will China do if the tensions or the trade war, the currency war, let's say a shooting war starts, what would happen? What would China do? Well, one option that people have talked about is that China might just dump all of their treasuries onto the market, because they hold about $1 trillion worth of United States debt right now. And if they just sold that, it would send shockwaves throughout the financial system. Now, when the coronavirus panic really set in, there were a lot of countries that really quickly needed access to US dollars, and so they started dumping their treasuries. But the Federal Reserve didn't want this affecting the financial markets, the credit markets, too much, and so very quickly they set up what are called swap lines. And this simply was an avenue that allowed central banks to trade dollars for treasuries. So the Federal Reserve opened up these lines and said, hey, if you need dollars, give us the treasuries back directly instead of dumping them on the market, so that it doesn't hit the credit markets, doesn't hit interest rates, doesn't cause a bunch of unforeseen and unintended consequences. We'll just trade them directly between each other. So here's your dollars and we'll take those treasuries. Now, one result of that, among other things, was that the Federal Reserve's balance sheet ballooned from a little under $4 trillion to a little over $7 trillion within the span of just a couple of months. But conveniently, one of these swap lines was not set up with China, and it's not set up with all countries. It was set up with just a couple of countries. And so if China did decide all at once that they were going to unload all of their United States treasuries onto the market, well, that would create ripples in the system at the very least. Now, what would likely happen in that case is not as drastic, not as dramatic, and not as significant as a lot of people talk about. Yes, it would cause some crazy things to happen in the credit markets, but ultimately that selling by China of the treasuries would get absorbed by all of the other players, especially the central banks, who would then work with the Federal Reserve to swap it back out for dollars. And ultimately, yes, the Federal Reserve would just buy up all of that debt. It's only $1 trillion. Their balance sheet is already $7 trillion. And so they have the ability at the drop of a hat to print $1 trillion US dollars and use that to purchase $1 trillion worth of treasuries that have just been put onto the market for sale. And they would absolutely do that because the very last thing that the government and the Federal Reserve wants is for treasury rates to spike. And with bonds, if the price of a bond goes down, that means the interest rate spikes. And I've talked about this before, but if that happens to too much of an extreme, the government becomes insolvent. Right now, the United States government is getting very little in the way of tax receipts, and their total debt load is ballooning. And so if interest rates spike, the only way that they're even paying for their bills, plus the maturity of old debt, plus the interest on all existing debt, is by taking on new debt. And so if interest rates spike, they won't be able to afford to do any of that. And so it is the only option is that rates on treasuries are kept at a very, very, very low number, ultimately basically zero. And so, yes, the Federal Reserve would absolutely, at the drop of a hat, print $1 trillion to buy up that $1 trillion of treasuries that the that China dumps onto the market. Now, the treasuries, that's actually not the real concern. The real concern is what China would do then with the dollars that they get in exchange for those treasuries. Because when you sell a treasury, you get dollars back. And if you don't want treasuries, which are basically just dollars that pay you an interest rate, you definitely don't want to keep dollars, which are dollars that don't pay an interest rate. And so you'd see massive downward pressure on the dollar as China would do everything they can to start getting rid of those dollars. One thing that would do is push down the dollar very significantly versus other currencies. The second thing that it would do is push down the dollar relative to goods and services and products. And the way that manifests itself is that dollars eventually would make their way back to the United States. That $1 trillion would all come flooding back into the United States in the way of purchasing goods and products that are sitting in our warehouses, purchasing assets. You'd basically have a $1 trillion stimulus just flooding into the United States market, pushing up asset prices and pushing up product prices. And the result of that would be the same as the result of stimulus has always been, which is price inflation, because there's more dollars chasing the exact same number of goods and services. Now, in the article, it was clear that this nuclear option would kind of be reserved for extreme cases like military conflict or sanctions. And seemingly in response, today Trump was talking about China, and he said that he really wants to work towards decoupling from China because he views the relationship that the United States has with China as being bad for the United States and good for China. Now, in reality, the only thing that would be bad or worse for the United States is more restrictions on what United States businesses and people can do with their money and with their business choices. More tariffs and restrictions on where in the world and who the United States businesses and people can do business with is ultimately only going to be a drag on United States growth and the economy here. And ultimately, the source of the United States power throughout the world comes down to the fact that the rest of the world uses the dollar. And there are massive privileges that come with holding the reserve currency, privileges that are basically only used if they are abused. And the more the United States abuses the privileges that it has by issuing the global reserve currency right now, the sooner the day will come when the dollar is no longer the reserve currency. As always, really appreciate you guys watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like and subscribe button and check out additional resources that I have for you in the description below. You guys are the best. Have a great day.